A large storm will be coming to the United States as we go into this upcoming weekend, and this could be our next big severe weather maker that could bring more severe weather like damaging winds, hail, and tornadoes to parts of the United States. In addition to this, our weather pattern is going to continue to be brutal for much of the United States, where a heat wave will dominate the Great Plains. On the flip side of things, colder weather will continue across the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and East Coast, but that could change as we go into this upcoming weekend. So in today's forecast, we're going to break down exactly what you need to know about the weather over the next 7 days across the United States. We are going to begin with what's happening, though, across the United States this morning. And overall, things have been relatively quiet for most of the United States, at least for the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, where a high pressure system at the surface does continue to bring drier and cooler weather to many areas for this time of the year. Nice 70s and 80s for high temperatures. On the flip side of things, we had a lot of severe weather yesterday that spanned across a relatively large area. This is what's left from a complex of thunderstorms that went through Oklahoma and Arkansas last night, and that has now moved through areas like Louisiana and Mississippi, where it's falling apart. It actually brought over 50,000 power outages to Arkansas yesterday. We had lots of scattered severe weather up and down the East Coast and through the Dixie Alley. Nothing really substantial when it comes to a tornado risk materialized, but we did actually have a couple of flash flood emergencies back over in both Long Island and as well as back over in southwest Connecticut, where many areas picked up as much as a foot of rain yesterday, which was definitely a surprise for some of those areas. And then back over on the West Coast and through the Rocky Mountains, things are pretty typical for this time of the year. Just some showers and thunderstorms along the Rocky Mountains, and a little low pressure system just sitting offshore there of Washington and Oregon, bringing some showers and even a few thunderstorms to both Washington and Oregon. Now let's talk more about that big storm that'll be impacting the United States as we go into this weekend and then eventually early next week. And we're going to begin with the jet stream, which gives us an idea of the weather patterns that are happening across the United States. Right here is our massive ridge, aka a heat dome, that is currently in place across the southern plains. This is essentially a large wall that is blocking any sort of storms from entering the United States, which in nature will keep things relatively quiet for most of the Great Plains, Midwest, and Ohio Valley, basically for the next 7 days or so. But it's not going to last super long, because we are eventually going to see this kind of collapse, and eventually we're going to see a big storm that will enter the United States, and you'll see that here in just a second. I also want to point out we do have a low pressure system just north of New York. This is going to continue to usher in cooler air to much of the Midwest, Ohio Valley, Dixie Alley, and East Coast for the next few days. Now, by the time we go into Thursday into Friday, watch that ridge start to become a little bit weaker, but it is still present. It's going to be present across the Great Plains, and even the Midwest will start to see a bit of an increase of temperatures by the tail end of this week. But this right here is the large storm that we're going to be watching for very closely, because this will have the potential for bringing some sort of severe weather event to some of the United States. Once we go into Friday into Saturday, watch that storm really just kind of build over California. What this is going to be basically doing is just kind of sitting here probably throughout Friday and Saturday, and then once we go into Sunday into Monday, that's when this will likely eject over the Rocky Mountains. This will likely become a negatively tilted trough, which is why this is a bit more concerning. Usually when we see negatively tilted troughs, it's much more common, by the way, in the spring to see something like this, but when this happens, we are usually talking about some sort of severe weather event. Sometimes even a tornado outbreak can happen with something like this. Now, I'm not saying we're going to see a tornado outbreak. I'm just saying it is something that we do see sometimes with negatively tilted troughs in particular, as they pull a lot more moisture, and also there's a lot more spin in the atmosphere. And one other thing I do want to point out is that the timing right now for this particular trough is still uncertain. The European model in particular, which is the one that we're looking at right now, initially had this ejecting closer to like Saturday. Now it's closer to Monday. So the timing is going to matter quite a bit here, because the later this ends up ejecting over the Rocky Mountains, the more likely that this is going to be a little bit weaker, and also the more likely that this is probably going to be something that we're watching for early next week, so not nearly as much this weekend. So a couple things to note there, but again, I'm going to kind of break this down for you more in simplistic terms in just a second. Once we go into Tuesday into Wednesday, that trough moves into Canada. We'll likely have another storm right behind that one as we go later into the week, and this one could end up being another big storm somewhere up here in the Midwest or even the Ohio Valley. It's definitely something that we're gonna have to watch for, but even this is still about 10 days out, and the one that we're looking at right now, keep in mind, is like 5 to 8 days out, and that basically means that there is definitely still uncertainty. There are things that are definitely not set in stone right now. Now, here's what the European model is showing for Saturday and Sunday in terms of dew points, and this is pretty interesting because this is basically showing you how humid it is going to be here in the central and northern plains. It is a quite favorable environment when it comes to just pure buoyancy. We have dew points in the mid to upper 70s 70s in many areas in the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, back through Nebraska. This is a sign that we at least have a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, which is one of the key ingredients to seeing some sort of severe weather event. Here's that low pressure system by Monday evening, tons of moisture throughout Minnesota and Iowa. This could set up some sort of severe weather event in those areas, and then Tuesday things will probably try to recycle when we get another trough or something along those lines, maybe some small scale severe weather events in like Midwest or maybe the Ohio Valley. Now I do want to reiterate again that this is still something that is over 5 days out, and usually when we have something over 5 days out, we don't exactly know what's going to happen and where. There's still a broad area that we're watching, and that's why I'm using a lot of broad terminology like the Midwest or the Ohio Valley or the Northern Plains. I'm not going to say, you know, Illinois is definitely going to see severe weather because we just don't really know yet, but it is something that we are watching for, and those are areas in particular that we are watching for this particular event to occur in. Now here's another thing I'm going to show you with this particular setup, and that is the hodographs. This gives you an idea of spin in the atmosphere, and there's quite a bit of spin as we go into Sunday that's going to kind of line up here back over in parts of North Dakota, South Dakota, and back through Nebraska. And this is also where there's quite a bit of instability, which is what's plotted here with those, you know, brighter colors. That's what the colors are. Those little graphs that you're kind of seeing, those are the actual hodographs. And so those hodographs nicely curved in a few areas. That'll lead to at least some sort of isolated tornado threat on Sunday if the timing of this trough all does match up with this particular scenario. And then by Monday, we actually could see the potential for some more robust threat of severe weather in Minnesota and Iowa, with the potential for a couple or maybe even a few tornadoes if again the timing still lines up. By Tuesday, this will likely start to kind of die out a little bit more of a Canada and maybe Michigan sort of threat, and that would be mostly probably just wind or something along those lines, maybe some sort of tornado threat, but again we're still talking about something that's over 7 days out. And then after that, we'll probably start to see some sort of threat try to redevelop in the Midwest by the middle of next week, but even then again that still does remain somewhat uncertain as of right now. Now I'm going to show you the future radar, and this is kind of critical for this particular setup. So we're going to begin with early this week, which overall again the weather is going to be relatively quiet for most of the United States. This high pressure system at the surface is going to continue to dominate across the basically entire Great Plains in the eastern tier of the country. There will be some occasional thunderstorm activity with isolated severe weather in the northern plains throughout the middle and end of the week. By the weekend, we're going to be watching for that low pressure system to move across the Rocky Mountains. You're not really going to see it until Sunday more than likely, or Monday depending on timing. Right now the European model has this trough moving right over the Rocky Mountains late Sunday into early Monday. And then this is something that I'm going to kind of point out here that's also pretty key for this event, which is why there is just so much uncertainty, is because as we go into Monday, notice all that rain and those storms that are back over in Canada. But look here in the northern plains, Midwest, and even parts of, you know, the central plains, there is no storms that are currently present, at least on the European model, aside from maybe an isolated storm or two. And this is another thing that we're going to be watching for, is the capping. And if you're not familiar with capping, it is essentially a temperature inversion in the atmosphere that prevents storms from building up. That is something that could also be in play as we go into early next week, and it again is going to probably depend a lot on timing, but there's a lot of moisture and there's also going to be a relatively high amount of instability. So there are some things that are definitely going to help the severe weather threat, but the capping could be a big problem as we go into Monday. And then even as we go into Tuesday, things just remain again relatively quiet for the Midwest. There might be some storm activity, but again this does remain quite uncertain at this time. And then as we go into Wednesday into Thursday, that might be a time frame to watch for, because if we do get a second trough to eject, I think that all the ingredients will be more in place for a second storm over this particular trough that we are talking about, at least for the beginning of next week and perhaps even throughout the end of the weekend. So again, it's a very complicated forecast to say the least. Obviously we are still several days out, so a lot of the details are still very broad, but it is something that we're watching for, because I do think the severe weather threat is going to ramp up a lot more as we go into the very end of August. And honestly, I also think that we are due for another trough or two that are going to bring some severe weather before we head into a more quiet September when it comes to severe weather, and then the tropics will probably start to ramp back up again. So that's my general forecast, and it's very complicated. I was kind of 50-50 on making a video for this today, but I just kind of wanted to get that information out there in case anybody's just wondering what's happening for the next 10 days and why this could actually be some sort of concern, which I do think there is definitely some merit to this being our next big severe weather maker, whether that is the first or second storm, or maybe something even after one of these two storms. We're definitely going to be keeping a close eye on this in case something does happen. I don't think we'll have a video tomorrow unless something does change with the forecast dramatically, but I do appreciate you guys watching. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you've not already.